Executive Director here at the library. It's a pleasure to have you here tonight. Travis's lecture is the last in the lineup for 2023. And in 2024, in January, we have the nonfiction book group has discussions on January 30th and 31st. That is a book group which reads nonfiction works, and it's co-moderated by Lynchburg Public Library and Jones Memorial Library. You don't have to read the whole book. You are welcome to come to either to learn about the book, or if you read the book, that would be great. It is available at Lynchburg Public Library. And we have one librarian, that's me, from Jones, and one librarian from Lynchburg Public Library. And what we bring from Jones is we bring items from our collection that relate to the book. So we are reading The Splendid and the Vile for January. So if you're able to join us, that would be great. In February, we will have a special exhibit on the 100th centennial anniversary of the opening of the Dunbar branch. And the Dunbar branch was Jones Memorial Library's first branch library. It operated at Dunbar High School. So stay tuned. We will have a special reception and an exhibit starting in February, and the exhibit will be here in the reading room between February and July. And then in March, our history lecture series resumes again, and we have a lecture by T.J. Anderson III, and he's going to talk about his great-grandfather, Thomas Jefferson Anderson, who was one of the first African Americans elected to serve on city council, and that was back in 1885. So stay tuned for all of that. And if you would like to know about our monthly events or sign up for our e-newsletter, all you have to do is put your name and your email address on the register there in the elevator lobby. But now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome Travis McDonald to Jones Memorial Library. Travis, as many of you probably know, is an architectural historian who was hired to direct the restoration of Poplar Forest in 1989. And Travis's latest book is Poplar Forest, Thomas Jefferson's Villa Retreat, on sale over here in the corner. And the book shares the process of the 34-year restoration of Poplar Forest and the stories of the people who lived and worked there during Jefferson's lifetime. Travis is a native of Galveston, Texas. He received a degree in American history from the University of Texas and a graduate degree in architectural history from the University of Virginia's School of Architecture. He formerly worked for the chief historical architect of the National Park Service, for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, and has directed museum restorations in Virginia for more than 40 years. In 2011, he was awarded the Architecture Medal for Virginia Service by the Virginia chapter of the American Institute of Architects for his work at Poplar Forest. In 2016, he received a commendation from the Virginia Senate for preserving the heritage of Virginia. And in 2021, he was awarded the University of Virginia School of Architecture's Distinguished Alumni Award. So after Travis's remarks, we'll leave about 10 minutes for a Q&A. And then at the end, Travis will be available to sign copies of his book. So please welcome Travis McDonald.
Thanks, Deb. Thank you all for coming out on a cool evening. I don't know what happened. A couple hours ago, I was in a shirt sleeve outside, and something happened. So, let's see. Everybody sees these well enough. So I'm talking about my book, but this talk with images is going to be a little broader because it's all related. I've had to do a couple of book talks without images, and I always feel handicapped because images are everything. I think they'll help fill in some of the elements of the book, but I'll also try to cover those elements too. So this year was a very important year for Poplar Forest. We celebrated the 40th anniversary of rescuing the house, and if anybody doesn't get Lynch's Ferry magazine, you can find a copy. I wrote a small history of the rescue and the restoration, and I opted to do a lot more photos than text because photos tell a lot more than Texarkana. But also this year was the completion of the house restoration after 34 years that I had been directing. And so the book I just wrote is not about the restoration. It's really, I think, the third volume of the Poplar Forest history. And I hope everybody read the first volume that Al Chambers wrote in 1993, which is still the definitive history. I did not redo any of that. My book I just wrote is kind of what Poplar Forest means having been restored. What have we learned about Jefferson restoring his house after 34 years? And the middle volume is yet to be written, and I hope to do that in the next few years, which is the story of the restoration, which is just as challenging a story to put into one book as this other one. So my book covers some big topics, and I'll cover some of those in images, but one is, why Poplar Forest? Why did Jefferson need a retreat? What were the retreats of his lifetime? And how does it fit into the tradition of not just retreats, but seasonal houses, summer houses, country houses? And in that history, it is unique. I also cover how Jefferson ends up at Poplar Forest as one of the most experienced amateur architects and one of the most experienced builders in America. Nowadays, people know that Jefferson was an amateur architect, but most people don't know he was a very experienced builder. And part of my book is who built Poplar Forest. That's a very important part of the story, one of the most unknown stories of Poplar Forest, and one of the most poignant. And then there are all kinds of architectural threads that run through Jefferson's life that end up at Poplar Forest. Poplar Forest is important because it's been the missing middle piece of Jefferson's architecture. Most people know what he did before Monticello. They know what he did after UVA. Poplar Forest ties everything together. It's all related. They're all different, but they're all very connected. And then some of my book is about how Jefferson used Poplar Forest, who used it, who was coming and going, and the connections to the landscape design, which for Jefferson is never divorced from the architectural design, and things about the plantation. So, why Poplar Forest? Jefferson's other house, in fact, it's kind of funny, my two daughters grew up with Poplar Forest, and one time I heard them say to somebody, "Did you know Jefferson had two houses? His other house was called Monticello." Monticello was probably the second best known private house in America after Mount Vernon. And of course it became like a hotel for people dropping in, people Jefferson didn't even know. He knew that was going to be the case. So he started work on Poplar Forest while he's still in the President's House, as the White House used to be called. So somewhere around 1804, 1805, he starts designing the final Poplar Forest, even though he's thought about it for decades, at least a retreat house. And the reason why, some people say, why did it end up in Bedford County? Well, it was because he'd inherited land when his wife's father died in 1773. Most of the land and the enslaved people that he inherited, he had to sell off immediately because inheritance usually comes with debt. But he kept the Poplar Forest tract. Actually, in this area, it was Poplar Forest and Judas Creek land, almost 7,000 acres. He kept Poplar Forest, which was a little more than 5,000 acres, probably because of where it was. It was next to an old growth Poplar Forest. So as early as the 1740s, that part of Bedford County was called the Forest or the Poplar Forest. It was a very distinctive place, and Jefferson loves nature. So the route from Poplar Forest, Monticello to Poplar Forest, is not what you do today on Route 29. It's way out to the east. And if you look on a topo map, you understand why. It's very flat when you go that route through Buckingham Courthouse, Appomattox, and it even comes through Rustburg to get up to Poplar Forest. And we have to always remember Poplar Forest was a plantation. Although when he inherits it, it's barely a plantation with about 10 enslaved people. Eventually, he says it's one of his most profitable plantations, and it was one of 5 separate plantations he owned in the state, Monticello being one other. So the challenge for him doing Poplar Forest, well, before I get to that, the year after he inherits Poplar Forest, he buys what's right over the mountain over in Rockbridge County, because it was one of the 2 great natural wonders of early America. And he calls it the most sublime of nature's wonder. And he actually buys it from England, from the Crown. So that was one of his favorite places to go to. And he actually went there as early as the 1760s, more than 10 years before he gets Poplar Forest. So the challenge for doing something out in Bedford County is Jefferson's up in Washington. His workers and his workshops are in Charlottesville. Some of the things he's ordering for Poplar Forest come by ship to the port of Richmond, but then they have to get upriver or by wagon to Lynchburg. And so it's not an easy project, and it's frustrating for Jefferson because as a builder, he always liked to be in control and to supervise his work. And Poplar Forest was something that must have been frustrating because he wanted it started while he's still president so he could use it the year he gets out of the presidency. But fortunately for us, he does start it early because he writes letters that are very detailed to the workers in Bedford County, and they are writing letters back to him at the White House. Jefferson even has to drop what he's doing in 1806 to come to Bedford. He tells his daughter he has to help the bricklayer lay out the foundation. I don't think that's showing the bricklayer how to lay a brick. I think it's showing him how to do the geometry of an octagon house. And in fact, when we were investigating Poplar Forest, after the brick walls came up 2 or 3 courses, everything was shipped at 2.5 degrees. You know, what reason could you have for that? Probably Jefferson coming and looking at whatever was magnetic north at the time and telling the bricklayer, at 2.5 degrees, you can't tell any difference, except for Jefferson. So Jefferson is using the hired white bricklayer who had been working at Monticello, Hugh Chisholm, and the hired white carpenter, John Perry, who had been working at Monticello. And interestingly, both of them will work on UVA after Poplar Forest, like many of his other workers that he would retain for decades. So they are coming down to Bedford County. There are no workshops there. They do work, and then they go back and forth, back and forth. So the house is under construction, as I said, while Jefferson's still president, so that in 1809, when he gets out of the presidency, he can start using it. And this shows some of the hired workers, but all the hired workers, almost without exception, had their own enslaved workforce. And sometimes you know who those people are, sometimes you don't. But one of the most important stories about who built Poplar Forest was by 1809, John Hemmings, who was the enslaved craftsman at Monticello, by that time is the master craftsman at Monticello. The two Irish workers that trained him have gone off to remodel Montpelier. And John Hemmings is then in charge of doing all the finished work at Poplar Forest, all what we call the joinery, all the nice woodwork outside, inside. And John Hemmings has three nephew apprentices who are working for him, with him, learning their trade. And these three young men are Jefferson's sons, Beverly, Eston, and Madison Hemmings. And these young men worked next to their father building his dream house for 10 years. That's a very unknown but important story. So Jefferson starts using Poplar Forest, 1809. It's really a shell. It's unfinished, but Jefferson had never lived in a finished house his whole life. Even when he moves in the White House, it's an empty shell. And there's even a funny story when Meriwether Lewis starts working for Jefferson as his secretary. He pitches a tent in the East Room because there are no bedchambers to stay in. So Jefferson happily uses Poplar Forest for 14 years. It's a very large missing part of his known retirement years. If most people knew anything about him, they'd just say he went home to Monticello when he retired. But he went to Poplar Forest between 2 and 4 times a year, up to 2 months each time. You add that up for 14 years, it's a lot of time. If you know the story of Monticello when he dies, it's a sad story. They're putting all the furniture out on the lawn. They have to sell the house, sell the enslaved people. Jefferson dies, before that happened, but he thought Poplar Forest would stay in the family. But I like to think of Poplar Forest as the happy ending of his life, because those 14 years that he spent there were pure pleasure. And sometimes people have said that the essence of an ancient villa retreat, one of the things about it was impervious to reality. So if Jefferson had troubles, he could go to Poplar Forest and forget about him for a while. When Jefferson is getting ready to retire, he tells people over and over and over he's looking for tranquility, and he wants to retire to his farms, his family, his friends, and his books. Most of you would not put books in that list of what's important. For Jefferson, books were everything. He put together a library for Poplar Forest that was about 1,000 volumes. And when he sells his big library to replace what the British burned in Washington, he told John Adams in a letter from Poplar Forest, "I cannot live without books," which was a gross understatement. After about 1815, he starts bringing some grandchildren, in particular Ellen and Cornelia Randolph. Jefferson's daughter, Martha, who kind of gets stuck at Monticello as the hostess, even when Jefferson's not there, she had 11 children. Monticello was overrun with family, visitors, servants. If you understand that, you kind of understand the need for Poplar Forest. But Ellen and Cornelia are nice enough for historians. They write these great juicy letters to their mother back at Monticello talking about life with grandfather. And later in the 1850s, they write some very poignant stories about what it meant to be with Jefferson when they were 15 and 17. So in 1823, Jefferson goes for the last time to Poplar Forest. It's not quite finished, and he had intended to keep using it until he died, but his grandson, Francis Epps, had gotten married instead of going to law school, and Jefferson said, "Well, you have to have a house. I'll give you Poplar Forest." So that was the last visit Jefferson made. It must have been a very bittersweet time. Francis lives there for 5 years with his bride, and I'm sure he doesn't appreciate all that went into the house. And in 1828, he sells it and goes to the newest American frontier, which is Florida. So Florida had only been a U.S. possession for 6 or 7 years. It had been Spanish before that. He goes to, not down Miami way, but he goes to northern Florida, which looks like Georgia, Alabama, and he becomes a pioneer there. Takes all the great stuff from Poplar Forest down there, lives in a log cabin, eventually becomes governor, builds a big mansion, is the father of the Episcopal Church, starts a college, and he does pretty well. But 1828, the house, Poplar Forest, goes out of the Jefferson family. So the next family, the Cobbs-Hutter family, own it for 117 years. And so a lot of people around here still know it was a Hutter place, and then thereafter the Watts family. But it slowly fades from Jefferson's very neoclassical, modernistic, personal design into a farmhouse, because in 1845 the house burned, and they rebuild within the brick walls, the octagon walls, but they do things like they brick up 8 windows, they leave off the balustrade, the Chinese railing, the pediments, all the things that Jefferson put so much effort into. They want a good old farmhouse, having bought and lived in for a while a very modernistic occasional retreat. So these are circa 1900 photos. It was rebuilt in a very quick, kind of cheap Greek revival style. And Jefferson's landscape designs are also slowly disappearing. So, as I said, 40 years ago, after a couple of failed attempts, 5 people finally got together and bought Poplar Forest. When I say bought, they took out a mortgage. Then they immediately took out another mortgage for another piece of land, and another. And so when the house was sold in 1983, they only had 49.5 acres with it. So today it's up to 620. And I hope you've come in on our new parkway through that beautiful 600 acres. And that's one view of the parkway as it comes in. So this is the picture of what the house looked like when I started working there. It kind of looked Jeffersonian, but not quite. And it had changes from the 1840s, changes from the 1940s. You know, it had the 5 bathrooms, the kitchens, the mechanical systems, the closets, all that stuff. So, looking at the house, trying to find Jefferson, as I said, eventually ends up in writing a book about what we think it means. So, I'll go through these really quick, but very idealistic, no deadline schedule for investigation, looking at things with consulting architects who are restoring Monticello and UVA, and then a stellar advisory panel, looking at every square inch. Sometimes the evidence is as big as your fingernail, sometimes the evidence is microscopic, but what's important was, again, no deadlines of when to finish finding everything we needed. Great stories about materials, spaces. So after about 3-4 years, we finally could say what Jefferson designed, what he built, and a lot about how it was used. And again, accompanying all this evidence, physical evidence, were the letters. Not just as Poplar Forest is being built, but letters for Jefferson's whole life about Poplar Forest. So, somehow these are really fuzzy, but I think you get the idea. So one of the big things that was always in question was that middle room. When we started looking at Poplar Forest, that middle room had a 12-foot ceiling, which is what the perimeter rooms are. And we found evidence, written and physical, that it had been a 20-foot cube in the middle. And so this is what Jefferson designed, and what's important to always remember is it's not a conventional house. It's an occasional villa, and if he goes there by himself, usually with one servant, it can be very modernistic and very kind of personal and intimate. One indication of that is this is a 2-story house. Where's the staircase? He couldn't figure out where to put the stair where it wouldn't mess up the geometry that he's working so hard to control. So he just sticks the stairs on the outside. The telling thing about that is you only get to those stairs by going through someone's bedchamber, which says that there's no public intended to be in the house. It's always meant to be an intimate family place. So again, as we're doing this investigation, our consultants are drawing the house on paper with very detailed drawings, and that tells you where you know it or where you don't know it and where you have questions. So then it's a question of conservation. The house needed some help. It was really in a sad state, and putting it back together, though, was a rare opportunity to do a Jeffersonian construction process. So, for instance, burning limestone to get the putty for plaster, render, or mortar, using the same kinds of materials for structural members. Here's the 8 feet of missing brickwork added back to the middle room up on the top there. One of the most unique things about this as a restoration was following Jefferson's original sequence of what he did year after year. So if you were a visitor, came there on your vacation, we could say, this is 1812, and this is what Jefferson's doing. You just don't say, we're not finished restoring. You say where it is in time and place. So I'm not going to go through all these, but a lot of you have seen this over time, and it was really a great opportunity for visitors to see, a Jeffersonian process as much as we could make it. Once we got to the interior, what's significant is all of the woodwork, which was considerable. Even 4-foot-high moldings was all made by hand. And of course, they restored octagonal privy. So one of the only changes, or you could say maybe additions, was the 4-room wing on the east side of the house that had services like the kitchen, the smokehouse, the laundry. This was exactly the same size of this is Monticello service wings that you know, and it was based on the Renaissance examples from the 16th century by Palladio. But right before Jefferson puts the 100-foot wing on one side of Poplar Forest, he has just come from the White House where he's put 200-foot wings on the house. He was appalled when he got into the White House that there were no service functions. And of course, on any other Virginia plantation house, those were in the backyard. The kitchen, the smokehouse, the dairy, the laundry. Jefferson liked the idea of putting them in wings because you could reserve the landscape for gardening. So this is what was left of the wing after the 1840s. 2 rooms out of 4 turned into 2 buildings. 2 rooms had disappeared but were recovered archaeologically. And putting the wing back together was then a 9-year project, doing it in the same way that Jefferson's workers did it. The wing is a peculiar thing that Jefferson loves, and in particular, the roof of the wing with a flat deck is really his only architectural invention, and he tweaks that element over and over and over for 20 years. It also had a very modern kitchen as one of the rooms. So this deck, you know, we say, oh, it's a deck, big deal. Well, Jefferson's the father of decks in America because he wants to sit there, stroll there, go out and engage nature. And this is exactly like what the wing of the White House looked like. That's it. So as I said, the interior, handcrafted, same kind of tools, actually Jefferson era poplar wood from the property. Again, some of these are elements he does over and over and over through his lifetime. They're Roman classical details. The sash doors around the middle dining room were the first things John Hemmings made for the house in 1810. Jefferson prefers to have Virginia walnut for doors varnished instead of a painted pine door because you can show off the artwork of nature. He's all about materials. He's all about Virginia stuff. These doors are truly remarkable. And of course, Roman moldings from Roman temples were, I mean, people had moldings in Jefferson's time, but he is very academic in his use of those. Here's the Tuscan order tablature, the lowest order being put up in the passage, which makes that space very dramatic. Here, parts of the dining room entablature going together in 20-foot sections. Here you get a sense of the scale. Again, handcrafted, 1,700 parts for this. Here just going together at the top of the 20-foot ceiling. And this is how Jefferson last sees the house. The entablature is up in 1823, but it doesn't have its ornaments yet. Those will come a little later. One of the very last phases of this 33-year project was having these historic painters come for a month to hand make and apply historic finishes. And this is one little segment of how they do that, where they grind pigment into oil or other substances. And this is the process of putting on what's called distemper paint. Distemper really hadn't been used since Jefferson's time. The reason you would use that is if you want to put color finishes on your new lime plaster walls, you'd have to wait a couple of years for oil paint. Distemper or pigmented lime wash could be put on immediately. And this was a very exciting process to watch paint dry because this goes on black and within an hour it turns to its wonderful kind of velvety look of a gray. We knew all the finishes of the house from things I found. And again, this goes on, it looks like jelly when they make it, and it goes on very black, and this is what it looks like finished. And this is another room, the parlor, with a slightly different color distemper. And these are the moldings and the ornaments that finally went together in the dining room. And that's another long story. So the landscape, Poplar Forest, is not something I was involved in, but you've probably been there to see some of it being restored in the last 10 years. It's a very complicated story. It's not what Jefferson's doing at Monticello. It's what he intends to do at the president's house, but didn't do. Here's the almost completed north side of the house with the carriage turnaround, clumps of trees and bushes, and what's not in this picture are some beds of roses, oval beds of roses. So, in the end, as I said, Poplar Forest has kind of been the missing link to understanding all of Jefferson's architecture. We can characterize it stylistically as Jeffersonian. In some architectural history books, in terms of style, there's actually a chapter sometimes called Jeffersonian Classicism, because he develops his own style of Roman classicism, starting with Monticello #1 in 1769, and he works with that style all of his life and becomes very proficient at it. So Poplar Forest looks Jeffersonian because it's in his style. So a couple of the big themes: the octagon. Jefferson is enamored with octagons. He can do 6 kinds of math, but he loves geometry. And when he's a college student at William and Mary, he starts buying these British Palladian books from architects from the 1700s in England. These books are filled with octagons, none of which I can tell have ever been built, but they were images for Jefferson. And he starts drawing octagons, mixing sources like any true architect would. And I don't know how well you can see that. This is actually the first floor plan of what he intends to do at Poplar Forest. It's got an octagon room that pokes out, but it's not the full octagon. Eventually, he does the pure octagon, trying to do it without the stair pavilions or the porticos, but that's a little too idealistic. And so he finally ends up with, as far as I can tell, the first large-scale octagon house in America. There might have been one other, but nothing's known about it. So how did he use the octagon shape? Mostly in his drawings on paper. These are 3 examples. Here's more, here's more, here's more, here's more. He can't get enough of the octagon shape. And it's almost like Leonardo da Vinci's drawings. You can kind of see Jefferson's mind at work in these drawings. He figures out every conceivable way to use these shapes. And it's a big story that nobody's really tackled. The other big theme, some of you know about this Renaissance architect named Andrea Palladio. He's probably the most famous architect of the Western world. He's doing these villas in the north of Venice in the 1500s. Jefferson likes him because of the rules he published in his book. And Poplar Forest is all about the rules, the proportions, the dimensions that Palladio is picking up from the ancient Romans. Jefferson loves these rules and always follows them. And here, where he's converting Italian inches to American inches, he sometimes has 6 decimal places on a number. He loves numbers. He's all about numbers, and it goes back to the Greeks and the harmonics of numbers and how man is fitting into the world through numbers. So this is Palladio's most famous building, the Villa Rotunda. It's probably hard to see that, but it's a centralized house with a tall central space in the middle. Not unlike Poplar Forest, is a centralized house with a tall space in the middle. I used to think this was in reference to the Villa Rotunda, but I'll tell you in a minute what I think now. More Palladian are how Jefferson uses these 2 earthen mounds on each side of the house that are mimicking a Palladian plan, and he's connected them to the house by a double row of trees. That's very unique and clever. But Poplar Forest is also very French. One of the biggest influences of Jefferson was spending 5 years in Paris in the 1780s. And it had a huge influence on him combined with Palladian influences. So that the house, as I said, was very modern, and one of the most telling statements was there were only two friends Jefferson invited to come to the house. They were both foreign friends, and one of them was an Englishman named George Flower, and he wrote a description of the house, and he ended up by saying it was like a French chateau. So he's an Englishman who sees it as French. What's French about it? Skylights. This is probably the biggest domestic skylight in America. They're extremely rare, but they're all over Paris and Europe. Glass doors, bringing in more light, seen through the house through 3 sets of glass doors. The floors that Jefferson said were a European floor, not that it's oak or herringbone, but that it has an oil, a wax, and a polish. This whole wall of glass on the parlor, in the parlor, that is connecting the indoors and the outdoors, that's extremely French. French houses for the time were known to be very open, airy, and connected to the landscape. And Jefferson doesn't do a floor-to-ceiling glass door. He puts 3 window sash together for the same effect. And you open up all those window sash, and it feels like you're connected to the outdoors. And of course, the French bed alcove in the middle of his bedchamber, probably so he doesn't have to sacrifice a door or a window or a fireplace. So I now think of this middle room of Poplar Forest as coming from Paris. So it's a very tall central room with a skylight, and there are any number of new fashionable houses in Paris when Jefferson lives there, where you walk in the front door into a central dining room that's very tall with a skylight, followed by a drawing room. Poplar Forest. And there's no other high-style American house where you would walk in the front door into somebody's dining room. That tells you a lot about where this is coming from and how the house is used and by who. I don't even see this very well, but this shows every element of the Poplar Forest plan being determined by something called a Root 2 analysis. And don't ask me what that is. I had a mathematician do this. But again, it's all about the numbers and the geometry. So the middle is a 20-foot cube. It's surrounded by octagon rooms or half octagon rooms that are in the big octagon. The landscape is done by modules. The house is sitting in a circular road, geometry into the landscape. The circular road is in a 10-acre square, which is in a 61-acre yard. So starting from that middle dining room, the geometries, the numbers just radiate out. And you have to think, everywhere Jefferson looks, he's got numbers running through his brain. So in the end, we can say that Jefferson finally, at the end of his life, had the liberty to pursue his own happiness. Why did he take 14 years to build what I think is his most perfect work and not show it to anybody? If you had done a house like that, you would be showing it off. As I said, the only people who saw Poplar Forest were family, some neighbors, and 2 foreign friends. Monticello was the great place you showed off. If nobody was going to see Poplar Forest, why couldn't it have been a rustic retreat with a lot less effort and expense? It really has to be seen as a treat to himself. He wants to do this one exquisite, perfect thing just because he wants to. And I think the reason why it wasn't shared was it was so personal, he couldn't share it with anybody but family and very select close friends. So I want to just run through a couple pictures. as I said, in my book, I cover a lot of these subjects. Some of these are, as I said, related to Jefferson's life as an architect and builder. One of the last big thing he did in his life was to create the University of Virginia, and a lot of that came from Poplar Forest. Letters from Poplar Forest to UVA and letters back and forth. UVA was his magnum opus, and most people didn't have a clue what he was putting into it. He not only conceives of a new kind of university in the world, he comes up with a curriculum, he hires the professors, and then he's got to have it built. It's a 9-year project, up to 200 people working on it, and he is not only designing it, specifying it, ordering materials from all over the country and even Europe, and then supervising it for 9 years. It's a huge thing, and it's all related to what was before Poplar Forest, what was before that, Monticello #2, before that, Monticello #1. So now that we've restored Poplar Forest, it really is there for everybody to interpret, and more importantly, to go there and to feel Jefferson's presence. You can imagine the sounds of Monticello with all those people, family, visitors. The sound of Poplar Forest is Jefferson's mind, reading, writing, thinking, and I think it's the only place you can really get as close as possible to the mystery man. For all he wrote, he's still a mystery. Having worked with him almost every day for 34 years, I can tell you, I don't know the man. If you think you know Jefferson, you're fooling yourself. Anyway, I hope that wasn't too much for this, but I'd be happy to answer questions. Okay, any questions?
As far as your research, did he keep every letter he ever wrote? I mean, there just seems to be so much material.
After 1804, Jefferson had acquired what was called a polygraph machine, which is not what you think of, but it's a machine that wrote 2 letters at the same time. And so after that time, he always kept one of his letters. Even before that time, the only way to have a copy is to hand copy it. And the federal government had, I don't know how many copy clerks, who, if you did a document and it was important, you handed it to your clerk and he hand writes a copy. That's it. There was another kind of weird thing called a press copy, where when your letter was still kind of fresh with ink, you'd roll it through some rollers to get a really faint copy. That was not such a great thing. But Jefferson, it's interesting, he sometimes wrote a dozen letters a day to people. None of them are short. They're all about somebody else's letter that was sent to him. The Jefferson Papers Project is almost finished doing those, but for sometimes a half of a year, there's a volume about that thick that has his letters that are to and from him. But he kept all his letters organized, by date, by person. And when he died, his family offered that amazing organized collection to the government. They kept it for like 10 years, saying, we're not sure we want this. The papers got, strewn about, they got lost, they got damaged. And finally the government said, we'll take these, but you can have the rest back. But by then, it wasn't a complete collection. But yeah, Jefferson, not only prolific letter writer, he had his memorandum book of every penny he spent every day and on what. He had his farm book. He had his garden book. He had his building book. You know, and for all of that, he's still the mystery guy. Yeah. Do you have a question?
Yes, well, you always see the picture of the ring road around the house, but I was kind of surprised, unless you just can't see it, that when you did the entry road, it's not there, right?
The ring road is about a third of it is still there today. It encircles the core, which is 5 acres, but you didn't get to it on axis like our former entrance road. You came into the sides, but it's still there as far as they've excavated, and it was lined by double rows of paper mulberry trees on 20-foot centers. So it's a ring road with an encircling 2 rings of trees.
Is there any plan to restore that?
I hope so. You know, there's a lot on the south side of the house that hadn't been restored. Alleys of Kentucky coffee trees, flowering shrubs, clumps of flowers and bushes. All of that is known, it just hasn't been restored yet. So there's a lot, even though we finished architecturally, there's a lot to do for decades in the rest of the landscape and on the plantation.
When he built the University of Virginia, did he have financial backing, or did he finance building it himself, and how did he do that?
The question is, who financed UVA? It was a state project, but very few, if any, other than his closest friends, kind of understood Jefferson's vision for what he was doing architecturally. And he was never good himself at explaining his vision. He just had good friends like James Madison who would say, he knows what he's doing, just give him the money. But, you know, why was the very first pavilion out of 10 on the lawn number 7 in the middle? Probably because he was afraid if he did number 1, that would be it. And so every year they did 1 or 2 more buildings, and the people in Richmond were saying, okay, let's open up the university. And he said, nope, 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 nope. So finally, the last building, the rotunda, is about halfway constructed, and he finally said, all right, you can start the university. And you know, he's been recruiting the best professors from all over. They're all bachelor professors. And of course, they're living on the 2nd floor of every pavilion. The 1st floor is the classroom. Professors lived on the 2nd floor. And it's their parlor on the 2nd floor where Jefferson is actually spending more money than he should. He's splurging on doing all these elaborate Roman entablature moldings with ornaments made by this English sculptor in New York City who's making the Poplar Forest ornaments. Very few people are going to see those parlors. And, you know, it's, again, something he wanted to do for himself. They're not all the same. In fact, every one of them is different. And that cost money, but, you know, it was a very large expenditure for the state. As I said, you know, at one point, I think up to 200 people are working on it. Probably half of those are enslaved people. There was another question back there. Yeah.
So, how old was he when he inherited Poplar Forest?
I believe he was 63.
When he inherited it?
No, when he started building it, sorry. So when he inherits it, he's 40. He was born in 1743, gets it 1773. And he last went there when he's 83. He died when he's 86. So 3 years after he gives up the house, he dies, and dies thinking it's going to stay in the family. Fortunately, I think the grandson didn't tell him he was going to bail out. Any other questions? Yeah.
What changed
changes did the Hutter family make to the home, and how difficult was it to get back to what it is now?
What changes did the Hutter family make? Biggest change was rebuilding the house after the fire in 1845, making it into a farmhouse. They had one little bathroom by the 20th century kind of stuck on the upper outside of a stair pavilion, and probably a couple light bulbs hanging on wires. It was very unmodernized, and a lot of people around here still call it Jefferson's summer house. Why is that? It's because they might remember that the Hutter family, after the 1870s, used it only as a summer house. They lived in Lynchburg, and like anybody with means, you might go out to the country, to your country house for the summer. And Jefferson, though, one difference between Poplar Forest and any other seasonal second house is he went there at all times of the year. It's also unique because most families would decamp to their summer place. They would have big parties with all the neighbors, a lot big social scene. Poplar Forest is unique as an intellectual retreat for one man. And there are some examples of those in England in the 1600s, 1700s, but I can't find any in America that were like that. So, yes, you know, there's a tradition of summer houses, but that's not what Poplar Forest was. So the biggest change after that 1846 rebuilding by the Hutters was 100 years later when the Watts family want to reverse some of those changes and make it into a modern country house in 1946. Like I said, the 5 bathrooms, the kitchens, you know, all the stuff you wanted to do in 1946. So 2 big periods of change, and you know, all of those things had to be, you know, kind of reversed. And where we did what we call architectural archaeology inside the house. Yeah. How?
During the restoration, how did you find the materials and the workmen to do it in the way it was being done back in Jefferson's day?
Sometimes we had to have the patience of Jefferson. And if he wanted something and he had to order it from Europe, he could wait a couple of years and not substitute it with something else. You know, originally he orders all the glass for his windows from Germany. We ordered our glass from Germany from a company that makes a reproduction of what looked like his. For a long time I couldn't find somebody in the U.S. to make the sash cord for the window weights because it was hemp. And I finally found a Dutch company when we got the internet, and that company had been making hemp rope since Jefferson's time. So I can't think of anything except one example where we substituted a modern material for something Jefferson. You know, sometimes we had to kind of reinvent the wheel on doing stuff. Where do we get the craftsmen? I learned pretty early on that hiring experts for one thing or another wasn't the best route, because this was a team approach, and you hire an expert and they think they're the expert. I had much better luck hiring local people who were skilled, who wanted to learn new, you know, skills, traditional skills. The guy who was making the big moldings in that one picture, he worked in a modern millwork shop for 10 or more years, making things by machine. It took him no time to learn how to make them with a hand plane. So,
What was his name?
Dave Klaus. So what was important was the attitude, a skill level, slowing down from the modern, you know, work schedule where, you know, you throw things up as fast as possible. And, you know, people who just put their heart and soul into doing it right. And, you know, that's the kind of thing now that you can't go there and walk in the room and see somebody making a molding. It's hard to convey what the finished interior, you know, means and how you got there. So hopefully, you know, if I can get my next book done, it will tell a lot of those stories. Okay, that's probably enough for evening.
Thank you so much. And if you'd like to purchase a copy of the book, it's right over here. Thank you so much for coming, and hope to see you, if not before March, in March for the next lecture. Thank you.
Bob had something to add.